I am live. I'm going to be continuing reading Quentin Tarantino's Cinema Speculation. We've made quite the dent, and tonight we're going to be reading section 9 from the book. I believe it is page 177. The section is called Sisters. It's about 20 or so pages. I'm going to wait a little bit and see who shows up here in the next minute or so. Before I start reading, I'm just going to wait around just for a minute and a half or so. I want to thank all those that have tuned in for the read. This is an amazing book. I mean, it really is. I mean, for a film geek or anybody interested in the history of cinema through the perspective of Quentin Tarantino, it's a pretty damn good book. So we'll get started here. I'm really proud of how much we read. I've read together. We're about halfway through the book. And I guess without further ado, let's start. Sisters, 1973. Unlike most of the other movie brats, Scorsese, Bogdanovich, Spielberg, and their later day additions Joe Dante, Alan Arkush, and John Landis, young Brian De Palma didn't grow up devotedly watching old movies on television, nor did he keep scrapbooks, make notes, and keep files on index cards of all the movies he saw growing up, like Peter Bogdanovich and I did. And I would say also Scorsese. You see, young Brian wasn't a film geek, he was a scene science geek. Keith Gordon's adolescent, Peter Miller in Dress to Kill, and in adult form, John Travolta's troubled cinema technician, Jack Terry, in Blowout, represent the young Mr. De Palma. In Blowout, Travolta's Jack Terry might as well be describing De Palma himself when he was young to both Nancy Allen's Betty Boop voice Sally and the audience. It all started in school. I was the kind of kid who fixed radios, made my own stereo, won all the science fairs, you know, that type. Hey, what's up? Poloraxa. The young Brian didn't really get into cinema until college, and even then it was under the guidance of New York theater legend Wilford Leach. Brian De Palma doesn't become interested in cinema till after he has thoroughly explored theater. Apparently, there existed one or two Brian De Palma penned plays from that period. But unlike Scorsese, Bogdanovich, and Spielberg, De Palma didn't pray at the altar of movies. To Brian, film was an artistic means to an end. Similarly, his attraction to Hitchcock shouldn't be read as De Palma being overly invested in the mystery, suspense, horror genre. Even though Brian De Palma would be labeled the modern master of the macabre, as the text reads over 3/4 of the Dress to Kill one sheet, it's pretty clear he's not an enthusiastic aficionado of the genre. But while young Brian may not have been a student of the horror film genre, he was nevertheless drawn to it because of its capacity for audience manipulation. When young Brian discovered Hitchcock in school and started seriously examining him, it wasn't Hitchcock's themes that attracted him at first, save for voyeurism. It was Hitchcock's cinematic technique and his practical application of that technique inside of his scenarios that turned on the young De Palma. Hitchcock went in for big suspense set pieces, which he usually accomplished through cinematic virtuosity or daring surprises in the narrative. And Hitchcock either pulled them off, the merry-go-round sequence in Strangers on a Train, Marion Crane's murder in Psycho, the difficult murder of KGB agent by Paul Newman, and the farmer's wife in Torn Curtain, the birds in the playground, or he didn't, the Mount Rushmore climax of North by Northwest, the rushed rooftop climax at the end of To Catch a Thief, the degrading handling of Anna Macy's dead corpse in the potato sack scene, and Frenzy. For Brian, a kid who tore apart his transistor radio just to see how it worked, To take Hitchcock's suspense set pieces and break them down to their individual components was no doubt attractive. But another aspect of Hitchcock's technique, which was not the norm for most of the old Hollywood picture makers, that probably appealed to the younger De Palma, was Hitchcock's cinema first camera, first shooting style. The normal classic Hollywood movie sought for the audience to ignore the camera. Better for you to commit to this exercise of wide awakening dreaming if you forget you're watching a movie. So, to emphasize or highlight the camera or camera movement was to call attention to the fact that the audience was watching a movie. Why on earth would somebody want to do that? Nevertheless, inspired by Murnau, Hitchcock, along with Max Ophuls, sought to give the huge 35 millimeter cameras wings. Ophuls sought to give the huge Hopefully sought to give the huge 35 millimeter camera wings. For all the huge movie stars that Alfred Hitchcock worked with, a 35 millimeter film camera was always the real star of the show. Well, this approach to cinematic grammar suited the young student filmmaker. Brian De Palma didn't want to become a filmmaker to shoot footage of people talking to each other. I'm sure Brian watched Rio Bravo in college too. But unlike Bogdanovich, Scorsese, and me, he probably didn't dig it. He might have thought some of the lines were funny, but for the most part, I'm sure De Palma thought it was just a lot of Howard Hawks shooting footage of John Wayne talking to different people on the damn jail set. Same thing with The Searchers. I'm positive Brian thinks a whole lot of The Searchers is John Ford shooting John Wayne on a horse talking to Jeffrey Hunter. And if he did think that, he'd be right. But Hitch was different. He was always cinema first, camera first. Not the cinema of capturing actors reciting text, not the cinema of pretty pictures, but an aggressive cinema that manipulated audiences with both its fluid visual grammar and its, at times, savage wit. De Palma's attraction to Hitchcock was always far less personal than Bogdanovich's appreciation for either Ford or Hawks, or John Carpenter's attraction to Hawks, or Paul Mazursky's attraction to Fellini, or John Woo's attraction to Jean-Pierre Melville, or Scorsese's attraction to Mitchell Powell, or my attraction to Sergio Leone, or Australia's Richard Franklin's, the second best to Hitchcock-like thrillers in the 80s. Genuine admiration for Hitch, like Bogdanovich, Franklin sought out the elder filmmaker when he was a young man. Hitchcock's cinematic fluency was what young De Palma was enthralled with and wanted to appropriate at his own, less the man. Also, because of Hitchcock's commercial success, Brian realized film-going audiences accepted cinema first, camera first sequences more easily when they were done inside thrillers or horror films. A pure cinema approach is always an option for a thriller or horror film, the way it isn't for the other genres. Along with Martin Scorsese, Who's That Knocking at My Door, Jim McBride, David Holzman's Diary, Shirley Clark, The Cool World, Paul, not the diminutive singer-songwriter, Williams, Out of It, and Paul Morris Say Trash, De Palma was one of the leading lights of the New York New Wave. Young Brian had directed 3 shoestring budgeted New York feature films by the time he experienced his first legitimate commercial success, the underground counterculture hippie comedy Greetings. Greetings tells the 60s tale of 3 young men in Greenwich Village, from John, Robert De Niro, Lloyd, Garrett Graham, and Paul, Jonathan Warden, who are trying to dodge the draft. The film is called Greetings because that's the first word that appears on the telegram the Army sends to you on your draft notice. Then the film breaks down into 3 different storylines following the 3 lead protagonists. De Niro's budding pornography career trying to capture his peeping Tom fetish on film, which he calls peep art, Graham's Kennedy assassination obsession, and Warden going on a series of computer dates. De Palma made it in a partnership with his co-writer and producer Charles Hirsch. The way Richard Linklater's Slacker authentically captured Austin Weird before the phrase was put on t-shirts and sold at the Austin airport. Greetings was a 60s film that played like hippie notes from the underground. As many of the critics at the time remarked, it achieved an authenticity of a film made not just for a subculture, but by it. In many ways, what Ragney and Radu did for Broadway by making Hair, De Palma and Hirsch did for film with Greetings. And a film version of Hair would have been attempted at the time, Brian De Palma would have been a leading contender to direct it. That's how strong his hippie bona fides were. In fact, his split screen filming of the performance group's uh, Dionysus in '69 could have been his preparation for Hair. Well, Martin Scorsese's Who's That Knocking at My Door barely received any theatrical release. Greetings, for an underground independent film, was just short of a phenomenon, especially in New York. It was the first film to star Robert De Niro, and it established both Garrett Graham and Alan Garfield as two powerhouses in De Palma's stock company. It generated a sequel, Hi Mom, that brought back De Niro, Graham, and Garfield, and added Jennifer Salt to the mix. But one of the things that turned on its late '60s film savvy audience is the cheeky way young De Palma took Godard's experimentation of film grammar with a tiny sprinkle of Richard Lester and played it for laughs. De Palma even engages in a full scale spoof of cultural icon blow up in the service of lampooning the Kennedy assassination conspiracy. One of the things that separated the New York New Wave from their French counterparts was the New York guerrilla filmmakers were usually segregated into their own neighborhoods. The characters in the French New Wave movies all walked or drove down the streets of the same Paris. At any point, Charles and Zavour of Shoot the Piano Player could have bumped into Arthur or France, Claude Brasseur, and Semi Free from Band of Outsiders in a cafe off the Boulevard Saint Germain. The hippie Greenwich Village draft dodgers of Greetings, the Canal Street sharkskin wearing Italian American tough talkers of Who's That Knocking at My Door, the black Harlem gang members of The Cool World, the Alphabet City strung out junkies of The Connection, the factory freaks of Flesh, Heat, and Trash, the Long Island high school kids of Out of It, and lonely apartment dwelling David Holzman might as well inhabit different New Yorks. I mentioned that once to Scorsese, and he agreed. They were from different countries. Despite having said that, the hippies and Greetings break out of their neighborhoods in a way unthinkable for the characters in Scorsese's or Morrissey's movies. Way before Ken Shapiro would shoot himself, guerrilla style, singing and dancing his way down Madison Avenue in the groove tube as amused passerbyers gape at him on camera. De Palma would stage big run and gun scenes in front of large public places without a permit. The famous 4 minute long one take of De Niro and Alan Garfield in front of the Whitty Museum, the most hysterical sequence in the film when it comes to great acting partners for De Niro. Before Harvey Keitel, there was Alan Garfield. Garrett Graham's long lens assassination in front of the Met with De Palma's early films, you get a real sense of the New York acting scene back then. The performers are almost all young, class attending, small theatrical production performing actors of the West Village scene. De Niro, Garfield, Graham, Finley, Salt, Jill Clayburgh, Charles Durning, Jared Martin, Margot Norton, Ritonia Alda, Peter Maloney, Roz Kelly, and many others that didn't do too many movies, concentrating more on the theater. And that includes the black living theater actors who scared the living shit out of the white crew of Hi Mom for the Be Black Baby sequence. Those guys were scary, De Palma confirmed to Scene Fanatistique magazine. Take a collective, they all filled the frame with the late '60s zeitgeist authenticity. After the success of Greetings, De Palma and Charles Hirsch wrote a sequel, Hi Mom, at one point called Son of Greetings, that followed the adventures of De Niro's character, John, once he returns from Vietnam. First, he tries to turn his peep art into a commercial enterprise, getting the backing of smut film producer Joe Banner, returning Alan Garfield, and later he joins a black radical theater group called the Living Theater in their off Broadway production of Be Black Baby, and eventually he drifts into urban terrorism. While Greetings was a zeitgeist explosion of its time, captured on film, Hi Mom is one of the top 5 movies in De Palma's canon, the others being Carrie, Dressed to Kill, Blowout, and Scarface. It appears at the beginning De Palma planned on designing it like the first film with 3 sort of com- competing competing storylines. John's attempt to turn his peep art into a real movie, Garrett Graham's a different character than Lloyd, involvement with the Black Radicals, and housewife Laura Parker's 8 millimeter Housewife Diary film, which plays almost like a spoof, of David Holzman's diary. But after losing much of the Parker storyline in editing, it became a movie clearly and singularly about De Niro's character. To me, every single thing in the movie works. It was as if the first film was a smorgasbord of every effect De Palma and Hirsch could come up with and accomplish. But after its success, De Palma went through the first film, analyzed the most successful elements, and expanded on them. The first film had three protagonists. Hi Mom focused on De Niro, the most compelling of the three, keeps Graham the funniest, and loses the least interesting Jonathan Warden. Realizing the Alan Garfield scene made the audience laugh the most, he brings back Garfield, seemingly playing a more successful version of the same character, and builds the film's whole first half around him. I also think there's a realization on De Palma's part of what a truly gifted improvisational actor Garfield was, and he utilizes him for the benefit of the second picture. In both Greetings and Hi Mom, it's Garfield who writes the text of the scenes through his hilarious improv gifts. Like a rodeo rider on a bucking bronco, it's De Niro's job during these scenes to hang on for dear life. But it's the Be Black Baby set piece that makes the movie unforgettable. Suffice to say, no scene in a movie will come anywhere near it till 30 years later during the third act of Takashi Miike's audition. So, how did a hippie counterculture satirist turn into the modern master of the mockery? I'd speculate it was commercial necessity that was the mother of Hitchcockian invention. Greetings was such a success that Warner Brothers brought De Palma out to Hollywood to make their tune in, drop out satire Get to Know Your Rabbit, starring Tom Smothers, one of the real Zygas comedy stars of the era. But after finishing Rabbit, which is really funny, the studio put it on the shelf for 3 years. After the bad studio experience of Rabbit, De Palma realized by 1970 the 60s hippie aesthetic was dead on arrival. But De Palma's entire identity was tied to that aesthetic. What was required was both a reinvention of self and commercial genre of cinema he could survive and hopefully thrive in. But what genre would that be? For a filmmaker with such an iconoclast reputation, De Palma was acutely aware of the commercial concerns of the marketplace. Could say, to a fault, by this time De Palma had been making movies for almost a decade. He'd already shot 5 movies. Francis Ford Coppola might have been a mentor to Lucas, Scorsese, and Milius, but to Brian De Palma, he was a peer. De Palma had seen directors come and go. He knew in the industry nothing was more important than to keep being allowed to make movies. Also, despite his troubled relationship with Warner Bros., he didn't want to go back to the shoestring run and gun world of independent filmmaking. He liked having permits. He liked shutting down the street with police control. He liked being able to afford a crane. And the only way to keep in business, unlike Jim McBride, unlike Shirley Clark, was to make commercial movies people wanted to see. As he warned me after he saw and was surprisingly impressed with Reservoir Dogs, Quentin, don't get too esoteric with your subject matter. If you want to be allowed to keep making movies, you've got to give them a carry every once in a while. Consequently, he claims that that's why he didn't ultimately make Schrader's script for Taxi Driver when he had the chance. He didn't feel it was commercial enough. Later, he changed that. He felt Marty could do a better job with the material, but I think he told the truth the first time. So if De Palma is going to move into more commercially viable, less esoteric pictures, what direction does he move? Action movies? Well, that's ultimately where he did move in the 80s and 90s. But back in the 70s, making action movies meant making movies with Charles Bronson, Clint Eastwood, Steve McQueen, or Burt Reynolds. I can't really picture De Palma being fulfilled doing that. Also, it's doubtfully those old salty dogs would have the patience to sit around on the set waiting for Brian to execute his Rococo camera moves. But I can see a world where Brian De Palma directs the Ground Star Conspiracy, or Freebie and the Bean, or Crazy Joe, or Schrader's original script for Rolling Thunder, or 3 Days of the Condor. I can see De Palma making a great version of Death Wish, but probably with someone like Peter Falk or George C. Scott as its star. What a fucking dynamic picture that would have been. But Brian De Palma found a commercial niche genre he could make his own that wasn't action films and was related to horror films, but not exactly the same thing. De Palma's study of the techniques of suspense that Hitchcock employed is as well known as his ultimate dissatisfaction and outright disdain for all Hitch's movies after Psycho, even The Birds. I believe it was the emergence of Roman Polanski with his film Repulsion when De Palma began to be intrigued by the idea of doing a new modern type of thriller. The Polanski movie worked, but where a Hitchcock movie worked to entertain, Polanski's movie worked to disturb. Hitchcock could disturb too, but ultimately only up to a point. With Polanski, disturbance was the point. So in this new cinematic landscape, Polanski's Hitchcockian thriller by way of Buñuel struck a chord with audiences, critics, and no doubt young Brian. And then, when Polanski followed it up with Rosemary's Baby, De Palma must have thought, well, that's that then. Hitchcock is dead, and the world has a new master of terror and suspense, and his name is Roman Polanski. At the time, Polanski, Peckinpah, and Ken Russell represented a cinematic trifecta of provocation, with Roman proving the most popular and the most commercially successful by far. But then, right at the very height of his success, a horrible thing happened to the Polish auteur's wife and unborn child, the Manson family. Then suddenly, for the next few years, Roman would be sidelined out of the picture due to the tragedy. Polanski's absence left a hole another classy horror film practitioner could possibly fill. I also think the American release reaction and relative commercial success of Dario Argento's Italian Giallo, The Bird with the crystal plumage proved an inspiration for De Palma. Like Repulsion, it too used the not since Psycho tag on its one sheet and newspaper ads. Not that I think the snobby De Palma overly admired the Argento thriller, but I do think it's possible that the film did illustrate a modern 70s way to do horror film that utilizes Hitchcockian suspense techniques. Even the fact that Argento committed to staging Hitchcockian set pieces, I think intrigued De Palma, and the way the ad campaign implied a connection to Psycho, but with rougher, more violent implications, must have seemed like a good commercial idea to the younger director. Now, while I'm certain De Palma didn't hold Argento in the same regard he did Polanski, there still was something impressive about Bird with the crystal plumage that could not be ignored. I can also imagine part of De Palma's inspiration to forge a career executing Hitchcockian set pieces was his frustration at how inept he felt the highly praised Hitchcock homages from the French New Wave were, particularly Messieurs Truffaut and Chabrol. I can't imagine De Palma appreciating even a relatively decent one like Chabrol's Le Butcher brochure, probably chalking it up to a thrillless thriller, but I can absolutely see De Palma being appalled at Truffaut's amateur clumsy fumbling of The Bird Wore Black, as well as being dismayed by the affectionate praise heaped on it by New York film critics, probably the only thing De Palma and Bogdanovich ever agreed upon. It's doubtful a master filmmaker like De Palma was ever charmed by Truffaut's Ed Wood, like amateur bumbling, even under more appropriate conditions. But in the service of Hitchcock like thriller, backed by Bernard Herrmann music, it must have left young De Palma puking in the aisle. I can hear him ranting to Jennifer Salt. How do you do a Hitchcock film without any cool shots? How do you do a Hitchcock film where the camera is unimportant? So, with Polanski abdicating his throne, Argento pointing the way, and Truffaut and Chabrol demonstrating there was both a market and an audience for Hitchcock homages, young Brian started his career as a genre horror filmmaker, with the intention of eventually being labeled the new modern master of macabre, which he eventually accomplished. But as opposed to other genre masters, while De Palma liked Hitchcock thrillers and possessed undeniable talent in that area, I don't believe he made them out of love. I believe he made them to corner a market on a commercial niche he could call his own. If he could be known as the heir to Hitchcock, then like Hitchcock, he could make film after film. Leon and Corbucci made westerns because they loved them. Hitchcock and Bava and Argento made thrillers because they loved them. While De Palma liked making thrillers for a little while at least, I doubt he loved watching them. Hitchcockian thrillers were for him a means to an end. That's why when he was forced to return to the genre in the mid 80s, they were so lackluster. Ultimately, he resented having to make them and was bored with the form. Hitchcock's Frenzy might be a piece of crap, but I doubt Alfred was bored making it. But back in the early 70s, when De Palma was shedding his hippie love beads, he saw not only a genre in cinema that would attract audiences and in which his cinematic talents could thrive and expand. He also saw a hole smack dab in the middle of genre the young filmmaker felt he alone was equipped to fill. Armed with a good commercial script, co-written with Louisa Rose that accomplished all his Hitchcockian thriller goals, it was now time to figure out where he was going to set Sisters up. After the bad experience of Get to Know Your Rabbit, De Palma was wary of dealing with another major studio. This film couldn't suffer any clueless studio interference. If Sisters was going to work, it had to be unequivocally a Brian De Palma movie. We first approached Martin Ransohoff, who was running filmways and making television shows like the Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres. This has been a Filmways presentation, darling, and films like the Americanization of Emily and the Fearless Vampire Killers. Why would De Palma, with his leeriness of studio interference, go to Ransohoff, the man who fired Peckinpah off the Cincinnati Kid and took the Fearless Vampire Killers away from Polanski and monkeyed it around with it? Well, a few years earlier, 1967, Rosenhoff began dipping his big toe into counterculture cinema by purchasing the boutique distributor Sigma 111 Corporation. Sigma 111 mostly released foreign films like Closely Watched Trains and Cul-de-sac, but Rosenhoff also released three of De Palma's New York films, Greetings, Dionysus, in 69 and Hi Mom. And the way Sigma 111 turned Greetings into a New York box office hit was the reason De Palma had a legitimate film directing career. So, based on that friendly relationship and patronage, De Palma initially sold his screenplays to both Sisters and Phantom of the Paradise to Ronsenhoff. The original plan was for Filmways to go independent by having their own distribution company. Sigma 111 theatrically released both films, but that plan never transpired. Instead, Ransenhoff ended up pretty much shutting down Sigma 111 and concentrating on producing movies for their major studios, Catch 22, Fuzz, See No Evil. Then De Palma's worst fears of studio interference came to pass when somehow his scripts were moved from Ransenhoff to his rival at Filmways, Ray Stark. Ransenhoff and Ray Stark fucking hated each other's guts. Stark was one of the biggest producers in town. He was also one of the town's biggest bullies, and he was responsible for mangling more films than an El Paso drive-in movie projector. Immediately, Stark got to work putting his grubby mitts on Sisters, insisting that Raquel Welch played the Margaret Kidder role of Danielle and Dominique. Though maybe Stark could have delivered De Palma's original casting choice for the Janet Leigh like movie star victim role that surprisingly exits the picture after the first act, Sidney Poitier. Around this time, when De Palma was dating Margaret Kidder and living with Jennifer Salt, the out of it director Paul Williams, not the diminutive songwriter, started hanging around their house. Williams had started a company with his producing partner Ed Pressman called Pressman Williams Enterprises and had just made a movie that ended up on the Ebert's top 10 of the year list. The Revolutionary, starring John Voight, who after Midnight Cowboy was a bona fide movie star. So, through Paul, Brian became friendly with Ed Pressman and convinced Ed to buy his scripts back from the clutches of Ray Stark, with Brian even putting up his own money from Get to Know Your Rabbit to facilitate the process. And with Pressman's ultimately financing Sisters completely, then selling it to American International Pictures as an independent pickup, it's Ed Pressman who owns Sisters today. Sisters was De Palma's first stab snicker at both Hitchcock homage and metapsycho reworking. The critical pull quotes on the poster and the newspaper ads strategically evoked Psycho, but everything else sought to lure the same audience that was drawn to the bird with the crystal plumage. And Sisters ended up doing exactly what it set out to do. It accomplished De Palma's entry into commercial Hollywood filmmaking, and it did well enough to justify future films from the auteur. But it also generated good notices that emphasized the director's cinematic bona fides, marking young De Palma as a rising talent to watch. Pretty much everything a calling card movie is supposed to do, it did. And while especially compared to his better thrillers, Carrie, Dress to Kill, and Blowout, Sisters hasn't aged that well. Both Repulsion and The Bird with the Crystal Plumage satisfy decades later in a way that Sisters does not. In 1973, it was damn impressive compared to the other low budget horror films to come out that year. Sisters played like a really classy picture. In the film, a man and a woman, Philip, Leslie Wilson, and Danielle, Margaret Kidder, who meet on a TV game show, go out to dinner afterwards. They hit it off and go back to her apartment where they make love. The next morning, she reveals that she lives with her twin sister, Dominique, who we overhear but don't see arguing with Danielle behind the door, and that today is their birthday. The idea is that the couple, Philip and Danielle, are going to spend the day together. She sends him an errand to a pharmacy to fill a prescription. While he's out, Philip stops off a bakery and buys a birthday cake and has it inscribed Happy Birthday, Danielle and Dominique. All this has been a psycho-like setup to set the stage for a big show-stopping murder sequence, where Dominique kills poor Philip. Despite Psycho's classic status, does anyone really miss Marion Crane once she exits the picture? By comparison, Philip's death is heartbreaking. Then the narrative switches to a reporter, Grace Collier, Jennifer Salt, who lives in an apartment across the street from the two sisters and witnesses the murder from her living room, a la Rear Window. The film has a bunch of different elements. Long-standing De Palma stock company regular William Finley playing another creepy red herring. Charles, during officially becoming a member of De Palma stock company when he gives the film's best performance as a detective Grace hires to help investigate the murder. Gruff Dolph Sweet plays the first of De Palma's sarcastic police detectives who is more suspicious of our protagonist than of the killer. Like Hi Mom, there's a media inside media moments, game shows, news documentaries, as well as Siamese twins, insane asylums, a lot of great Bernard Herrmann music, split screen sequences, and the first of De Palma's split personality killers. The weakest part of the film, aside from one of the two female leads, is the script, which is more structure than story. Sisters established the method of Hitchcock homage that the director would later become known for, which has to take the story points of structural elements from Hitchcock's most famous thrillers, and even more than Polanski or Argento, commit to full-blown cinematic set pieces that evoke the master, except these suspense sets were pieces usually led to more violent and gorier outcomes than they did in Hitchcock 50s. In Sisters, De Palma takes the structure of Psycho. Victim Philip and killer Danielle are both presented in the film's first act as sympathetic protagonists, all building up to the big murder scene, where the film's two audience-identifying characters are revealed to be murdered and murdered victims. In the early 60s, audiences were generally fooled into thinking Norman's mother, not Norman, was the killer. But in 1973, after a slew of movies had made the Psycho ripoff a genre unto itself, audiences were more likely ahead of De Palma when it came to his big reveal that Dominique was really Danielle. But in De Palma's subversive 60s way, the murderer is a white female and the victim is a black male. Upon revealing this switch to the audience, the film continues to follow Psycho's structure of having a new protagonist enter the picture, a witness to the killing, who then begins investigating the murder. However, the way this new character, Staten Island newspaper reporter Grace Collier, witnesses the murder is taken from both Hitch's Rear Window and the director's own Hi Mom. Something else introduced in Sisters that De Palma would hold on to in some of his other thrillers is the split personality methodology of the killer. Margaret Kidder is Danielle, and she's also her dead sister Dominique. But like Norman Bates, she herself is unaware of the personality split. And like Norman Bates with his mother, she can engage in conversation between the two personalities without even being the wiser. With as little regard as he held for Truffaut's The Bride Wore Black, he still tore a page out of Francois's book by getting Bernard Herrmann, the composer most identified with Hitch, to compose the score in Sisters. And it's easily Herrmann's best score of the 70s. Only the score for Roy Bolting's Twisted Nerve comes close, including a stabbing string section meant to evoke Psycho during Philip's bloody death. But it was De Palma's masterly demonstration of camera pyrotechnics and his clever use of split screen and cinema within camera or TV within cinema that blew away the cinematic techniques employed in the other Psycho like thrillers of the year, of which there were a lot, mostly coming out of England from Hammer Studios. But as much as De Palma was adopting the cinematic grammar of Alfred Hitchcock and the story points from some of the masters of suspense scripts, split personality murder, murder witnessed through apartment window, he still carried over some of the trappings from the counterculture satires of Greetings and Hi Mom. With Brian's earlier movies, he had established his own vision of New York City, usually centered around Greenwich Village and Manhattan. Sisters takes place in a New York recognizable as De Palma's New York from the earlier pictures. Also in Sisters, The Greetings and Hi Mom, De Palma engages in a media satire like the crazy game show Peeping Toms that starts the film. Like most of De Palma's media satires, as New York Times critic Vincent Canby pointed out, what's so funny about them is how authentic they seem. The racial satire of Hi Mom is dragged into his Hitchcockian thriller, which all by itself places it apart from Hitchcock's work. The casting of a black male, Leslie Wilson, as the victim of the big set piece murder sequence isn't satire, but actually a progressive stroke. The satire comes in when the film's amateur detective, Grace Collier, speculates that the cops refuse to investigate the killing because the victim is black. Those racist pigs won't do anything about it. But the film clearly shows that's not the case. In Salt's characters, a muckraking intrepid reporter for the local Staten Island newspaper who writes opinion essays with headlines like "Why We Call Them Pigs," is a blithering idiot. But the film's funniest racial jokes is when the Peeping Tom contestants, Wilson and Killer Kidder, are given 2 free dinners at Manhattan's African Room, where black males in tuxedo tops and grass skirts serve as waiters, which, when it comes to ridiculous theme restaurant in movies, ranks right up there with Joe Dante's Canadian themed restaurant in Gremlins 2. A Mountie costume waiter asks Zach Galligan, "Can I get you another Molson's?" But Sister's real claim to fame, aside from establishing the template for the other Hitchcockian De Palma thrillers to come, is the film's build-up to Wilson's set-piece birthday cake butcher knife murder, still one of the most accomplished sequences of De Palma's filmography. The problem with Sisters as a thriller, however, is once the big murder moment and successful cover-up section is through, so are the thrills. De Palma and co-writer Louisa Rose only wrote half a movie, the Wilson Kidder section. The Jennifer Salt section is simply De Palma trying to wrap the movie up as quickly as possible without spoiling the goodwill generated by the film's dynamic first half. The best moment in the film's second half is a faux media moment. Reporter Grace Collier watches a TV documentary on the Blanchian Siamese twins, Daniel and Dominique, that could have been made for Hi Mom's ITTV documentary series. The problem with the film's second half is twofold. De Palma doesn't create any other real suspense sequences, and the other problem is Jennifer Salt's performance as Grace Collier. De Palma tries to present his woman's lib reporter protagonist as a pig-headed, self-righteous ass, and he tried to have fun with that aspect of the character. In her first scene with Charles Durning's detective, you can tell she's supposed to be exasperatingly foolish. And if you pay attention, you might even notice that a couple of her lines are written to be funny, but Salt's delivery just bulldozes over any comedic intent. So instead of being comically foolish, Salt Grace Collier just comes across as idiotic. Before Pauline Kael would begin to champion De Palma's thriller, she panned Sisters primarily due to Salt's performance. And for the record, I am a big fan of Jennifer Salt's earlier performances in De Palma's movies. However, in 1973, when I saw Sisters in Tennessee at the South Clinton Drive-In on a double feature with another bizarre American international film, Little Cigars, a film about a gang of dwarf bank robbers led by curvy blonde bombshell Angel Tompkins, I thought it was sensational and the filmmaking thrilling. I had never seen a split screen sequence before. For years, as I thought about different movies I like to make, they always included elaborate split screen set pieces inspired by De Palma's later use of that device. But I eventually do only two, a pretty decent one in Jackie Brown, but it turned on a narrative reveal rather than cinematic razzle dazzle. But when Daryl Hannah walks down the hall of the hospital in Kill Bill Volume 1, whistling Bernard Herrmann, then it slides into a split screen. It's almost as if Brian De Palma has seized control of the movie for a moment. After the success of Sisters, De Palma and Pressman would make Phantom of the Paradise together, starring Brian's colleague roommate William Finley as the Phantom and Paul Williams, yes, the diminutive songwriter, as the evil Phil Spector like record producer Swan. The duo were initially set to do the movie with American International Pictures, who were very happy with the De Palma Pressman team after Sisters. But when the studio balked at the budget that De Palma was asking for, the director and producer again went it alone. Both men using their sister's money to grubstake the film's pre-production. Eventually, they snagged a real estate developer named Gustav Berney, who had invested in three horror films around that time: Theater of Blood, Asylum, and now The Screaming Star starts. And he put up the 750,000 they needed to make the movie. Apparently, they needed more because early in the crew's checks bounced every week, and the production was always on the verge of being shut down. But the funny part about the De Palma Pressman Association is that both Sisters and Phantom of the Paradise were Pressman Williams Enterprises presentations, which means both Paul Williamses were involved with the making of Phantom of the Paradise. Oh, that's it. There's a little sub note here I guess I could read. The filmmaker Paul Williams was a real exciting talent during this era of independent filmmaking. His Long Island set high school film, Out of It, starring Barry Gordon and pre-Midnight Cowboy John Voight, is a charming trifle that surprisingly springs a powerhouse ending on its unsuspecting audience. Voight, post Midnight Cowboy, joined him again when he starred in his interesting The Revolutionary, which also included Jennifer Salt. At one point during the early stages of Mean Streets, which Ed Pressman almost preceded, Martin Scorsese tried to get Voight to star in the picture, playing the role that Harvey Keitel ended up essaying. In his attempt to court Voight, Scorsese even cast David Provell and Richard Romanus, two actors he met in Voight's Los Angeles acting class. I asked Marty why ultimately didn't Voight do it. He told me John Voight was a really wonderful actor, and so we talked about it for quite a while. And he was really starting to think about it after Midnight Cowboy. Voight was a major star, and to be in a film that at the point Jonathan Toplin, the producer, had gotten about 650,000 to make it. It just didn't seem like the milieu was right. Besides, at the time he was working with a guy named Paul Williams. He was Paul's guy. If he was going to do a low budget independent feature, it would have been with Paul. Interesting. Evie Schroeder. Hey, what's up? I don't know if he's probably no longer on here. Typhoneer. Hey, welcome back. Thanks for stopping in. Yeah, and that interesting. Brian De Palma's Sisters. Didn't know that was even a movie he did. I'll have to try to. Some of these movies listed, I definitely have to see if I can find them. They're probably hard to watch nowadays because they probably seem outdated considering how much, how much goes into movies today. Like the entertainment value that goes into movies today versus back then. Trying to keep people's attention is much harder today than it was back then. So it's going to be interesting to watch those old movies. So the 10th section, we made it to the 10th, and we are over halfway through with the book. Look at that. We got so much done. The 10th section is Daisy Miller. It's actually a really short chapter if I remember looking at it. Yeah, really short. So tomorrow we'll do Daisy Miller. Super short section. Anyways, yeah. Actually was watching Rolling Thunder today, and there's some interesting parts, but most of it's really slow, and it's just one of those things where you kind of have to force yourself to watch it to enjoy it. Uh, so, well, I know there's a section on Rolling Thunder. There it is, Rolling Thunder. So at some point we'll get to Rolling Thunder, but I was watching it today, and like I said, it is, you know, the kind of movie that I'm sure for its time was pretty exciting, but for today's standard, it's kind of, it has its moments, but at the same time, it's like, man, it seemed much easier to make movies back then. I don't know, maybe not, I don't know, but today there's just so much that goes into it. Anyways, it's still enjoyable. Rolling Thunder. It's on Tubi right now. If you want to catch it, Tubi's free streaming service. Anyways, yeah, tomorrow 9 p.m. Central, I'll go back live. Rodolfo, if you want to join me tomorrow as well, we're gonna read this whole book together. Hope you're enjoying it. Look how much. Don't you feel accomplished? I feel accomplished. Look how much we read. Isn't that pretty good? All right, let me bookmark it. Cool. Well, I'll see you tomorrow then. I'll bookmark it there. This has been another lively night of reading Quentin Tarantino's Cinema Speculation. We'll be reading tomorrow, 9 p.m., same time as always. Section 10, Daisy Miller. Everybody have a good night, and I'll be seeing you then.